So I work in distributive justice, and that is a core area of political philosophy that discusses what is the best way of distributing resources. And this could be within a family or in society, or it could be about global justice, or it could even be about distribution across generations of humans that come to the planet, or it could even be between us and other species that we have to share the planet with. No? So it really, it uses specific principles and concepts, and it's quite systematic, but you can really talk about many different things within distributive justice.
All right, so I wish I was better at segues. This is going to be rough. So I guess one of the first things I wanted to talk about was G.A. Cohen, and you have a paper on G.A. Cohen's historical materialism. So maybe we could introduce Cohen and his idea in a nutshell there.
Okay, I can tell you some funny stories. I was a student in Madrid, and I read his book. And I thought, and by then I was a student, I was working for Greenpeace, I was aware of all the environmental problems, and when I read the book, I thought, this is a very nice guy, extremely intelligent, really like a genius, and who has the heart in the right place and is trying to help the left with his philosophical ideas. But he's getting it all wrong because he was born, at a time where people weren't aware of all the environmental problems, and he had like a mental setup that was old. So I must meet this guy and tell him. So I started to look for him, and there was no internet, no? So I just checked on the phone book for London, which is where the book said, and I started to ring with my very bad English at the time, all of the people and asked them if they had written that book. No, so the first one who answered was, he said, no, I haven't written that book or any other. I'm a taxi driver. And I kept on calling people until I found him. And he then thought it was like such a hilarious thing that he started to make jokes, and we just got along wonderfully. And so he said, come over to Oxford, and then I went there to have a long interview, and then he's come with me to London and meet my children, and then he said he would write me a reference and for me to get a scholarship to go to Oxford. And so I ended up writing a critique of his view. And although at that time he still was a very convinced Marxist, and for him it was all very emotional because like his books and his work was a tribute to his parents and the Marxist upbringing that he had in Montreal, he was really a very honest person who wanted to learn if he was getting it right or wrong. No, so he treated me so well. I mean, he really was like a father to me. I became quite ill, and he came to visit me. He would sit at the edge of my bed and carry on discussing all of these issues, the 4-stage story, and all the problems with his reasoning and the environmental problems. So the idea is that for me, from coming from being born at a different time and having a different perspective on what are the big issues in the world, for me, Marxism was a right-wing theory. And that, of course, really surprised him because he was, in many of his works, he writes about how he had this communist background and his parents were so left-wing, and he grew up with the movement and the workers of the factory and all of that. But for me, the theory was right-wing because it was a theory where economic development and technological development is the key factor that moves history. There's hardly any room for the individual. All the emphasis is on production and growth, and all of the bad things that happen in history, slavery, all the aspects of class struggle, but also invasions, colonialism, everything was just functional, and it was explained because it made a positive contribution to more growth. So, and in the end, we get to the communist utopia where we are all very rich and we have plenty of time and everything is all right and nobody worries about distribution anymore because we live in abundance, right? So that's the story. And that story also I knew because I had studied a lot of theology, not by choice, but because, that was the sort of the syllabus that Franco set up for philosophy in Spain. I was very familiar with the idea of justifications of evil in the world in terms of their contribution to something good. So I already knew they're called theodicies that try to reconcile the existence of evil in the world with the existence of a omnipotent, benign being, because there's something called the problem of evil that is like, either he doesn't care or he doesn't know what is going on or he's not omnipotent, because one of those things have to fail. So people say, no, there's a way of reconciling the existence of evil with a benign, omnipotent and omniscient being, which is to find a role for all the bad things, no? So the history of philosophy is full of those attempts to justify, and Marxism fitted so perfectly with this idea that we start with the scarcity and then through class struggle we develop the productive forces, and all the emphasis is on sort of economic growth and productivity and so on. And it had the same aspects as many right-wing theories. So why not distribute now? Even like John Stuart Mill in 1848 said, we already have enough technology. The issue is the bad distribution. It's not that we need more productivity. The issue is distribution. But all of the other sort of conservatives keep on, well, we distribute later, or let's make the pie bigger so that the pie is very unequally distributed, but your share is going to be bigger. No? So all of that emphasis on postponing distribution to the sort of future communist paradise, talking about nature in terms of something that you have to be controlled and that is possible for human beings to control and dominate. And there was all this metaphor of controlling and harnessing and so on and using. So zero concern for nature or animal rights or anything that, so I was like working in the Greenpeace office. It was like, what is this? Like totally associated with right wing. And then there were all these issues of gender where, and he had that view as well, that I don't understand what feminists do. There's nothing for them to do. If we have distributive justice, if we have the correct theory, there's no reason to think about gender as another issue because, whatever is their share of distribution, that's what they get. And where's the problem? Where's the issue? No? And so for me, it was like, yeah, there are lots of issues that are specifically gender issues, and you cannot just expect your general theory to be able to address them all. And in fact, if you pay attention to the role of women in history that you have ignored, because, his book was all written in he and man, and it was all masculine terms. So he never thought that there were female slaves or that some people that weren't called slaves, they actually were, like in practice, like slaves. And he wants to have the emphasis on what really happens, an effective control, not on the law or the label that these people have, but on what really was happening to them. And so women didn't have the freedom to move around and sell their labor power to whoever they wanted. And so, according to his own definitions, there was going to be slavery in different periods and serfs in different periods, and all of the very neat organization that he had made. History is divided in these periods. Each period is characterized by a special type of producers. We had slaves, and then we had serfs, and now we have capitalism. Everything began to crumble down once you took a sort of gender perspective to look at his theory. So all the things that sort of concern people on the left, like people, your age, of course, but even like, 20 years ago, they just led me to think that this really, with his best intention, he was defending a right-wing view. No? And so that's what I wrote my thesis about. And then this paper that you read is one of the aspects in which, I thought it was a conservative view that neglected gender issues, environmental issues, and other things. Right?
Right. So I guess I'm gonna try to add on to that, and then I guess we'll see if you're happy with what I have to say about it, or if you'd want to make adjustments. But so the idea here is basically just that I guess production kind of drives history forward. So things that are good for production are going to be kind of preferred, or there Cohen says there's this kind of rational determination, right? Where if something is more productive, people are just going to go do that because why wouldn't they, right? So you end up. He gives the example in his book of this hypothetical society where they're just kind of growing crops and they're kind of doing it the old-fashioned way with like plows or whatever. But then he says somebody invents a treadmill that you can bump up productivity quite a bit, but it's going to require management. Like it's not pleasant really to use the treadmill, but it's more productive. So the society is going to they're going to do the thing that's more productive. So they're going to organize themselves. Their relations of production, to use some Marxist lingo here, is going to be it's going to organize based around the more productive things. And so now we have this story about okay, here's how we end up with class society, and there's this kind of orthodox story too, right, in Marx about the guild system being replaced by something more productive, right? You have the guild system where there's a little community of guild masters and their apprentices who are really good at doing what they do, but then you find somebody who can mass produce it or just produce it more quickly. They don't need the guilds anymore. But the guilds fight back. They don't like their stuff being replaced, but they get pushed out because they're a fetter on production. It's less productive. And so you end up with those kinds of stories about, production pushing history forward. There's that kind of rational, like, well, it's more productive. We're going to do that. Why wouldn't we kind of thing? That's kind of the general idea here. And so the critique that you offer in on behalf of feminism in particular is really interesting. There's this emphasis on like attitudes, right? Not everything is kind of purely rational, right? Like if everything was just rationally being pushed for production, why would you cut out, give or take half of your population from production, right? Like women weren't allowed to do a whole lot for a long, long time. And so it's like there's this big explanatory gap here, right? If we're trying to say that people are pushing production forward in terms of just being rational, then what's with the sexist ethos that's been around for so long, right? Why is that? That's going to not be good for production, clearly.
Yeah, I mean, that was one of the insights of John Stuart Mill, which people don't discuss a lot today, because one of the things that happened with feminism is that initially, when John Stuart Mill wanted people to become feminist in those days, he had to appeal to the general interest. So his emphasis was like, you're discarding 50% of the brains. Don't you realize that they could be, and if you're convinced that they're not going to be able to perform surgery or something else, well, we'll see that they won't be able to. But what is the point of a prohibition and wasting the possibility of somebody coming up with ideas that help us all, no? By just deciding not to listen to, half of the thinking brains in our society. And later, part of the idea of feminism was to say, well, that's a good point, but we also want to say that we must change something because it's bad for women. We don't always have to say that something is sort of bad for society so that we, somebody pays any attention to our argument. No? But so it shows that even though they were living at the same time, Mill and Marx, when you read them, it sounds like they were living in different centuries, because Mill was already animals, nature, zero growth, feminism, all of the things that are sort of students today are concerned with, and Marx was still with his very sort of old-fashioned and also theological framework, working in what appeared to me like to be a very old-fashioned, perspective. No? And he, maybe for me, I think the easiest example of what you have described with the treadmill and so on is Cohen's example of the army. No? So if you're fighting with swords, you have to give a sword to each of your soldiers, right? They can't be sharing a sword, that would be a disaster. So then they invent like a machine gun that is so heavy that you need 3 people, then the army is going to be organized in trios. And then later on you invent like this big cannon that you need more people to move it. So it would be, or reorganized again in groups of 5 or 6 or whatever is the number that is required to push the cannon and aim it properly and so on. So that's the idea that, whatever something is organization that works best for society, that is what is going to be adopted. But of course, discarding 50% of brain goes against that. And, part of the explanation is something that somebody with Marxist mentality and Cohen mentality thinking about who has the power should have figured it out, that it's not just what the good of society, sometimes it's the good of the individual, and the good of the individual, he benefits, or maybe he I don't know, there's a way in which people can profit from their canyon being owned by only one person who then rents it or whatever. There would be some system that benefits the powerful and not the powerless. And then that is what is going to be used. So the benefit of society doesn't always win. No? That's a problem.
Yeah. And I think what you're getting at is something that I thought while reading the book too. It's like, even in the treadmill example, he doesn't spend much time thinking about different ways of organizing it. He just it just happens in that example that there has to be a certain set of managers looking after the people on the treadmill or whatever. But I don't know. It's like, I guess I read that and I was like, that sort of makes sense, but it also seems like there could be different ways of organizing it, right? You don't have to have, in principle, this kind of people just falling into managers and managed. And I don't know, it just doesn't seem like there's only one path here,
Yeah, I mean, and the other thing is what you pointed out before. People aren't always 100% rational. No, so they can feel threatened, or they are very used to one way of looking at things. For example, now you're like 22. The idea that for you, the ideal woman is somebody who has no education, so that you have complete power over her. She can't find a job, so it depends entirely on you. Of course, that increases your power, but you would never think that this is now your ideal. No, so people over time, they realize that things that they thought were good for them, even from a selfish point of view, then they change. No, even selflessly, people now want to have a conversation, and they want somebody educated that can help them make decisions, and want somebody else who also has a job in case something happens to them. There is another one, etc., etc. So now people realize that even from a selfish point of view, those men in the past that had all the power, they weren't even acting exactly on their interest, because there's the fear of losing control and all of these sort of insecurities and traditions and what the people will think, and all of that also play a role in their decisions. It wasn't just entirely sort of lucid and rational, or the sort of naked self-interest. There was a lot of distortion from various other factors, and in the end, we come up with a system, a sexist system, which is self-fitting, and that is bad for men as well. It's bad for everyone. No?
Yeah, that's really interesting because, yeah, on the surface, right, you've got the men who are in control, and it's like, okay, that's great for us. But then you think about it for a little bit, and it's like, well, no, not really. I mean, it's bad for all of us, right? I mean, obviously, all of us would benefit if we had, all of us cooperating, women included, right? So it's actually, yeah, like you said, it's self-defeating. It's not rational. It's unhelpful.